Hi everyone, the Raven that refused to ever stop talking here with Rhyme Signatures, the nerdiest music review this side of having lots and lots to say about the latest and most controversial piece in the prog rock community. And today we're going to be doing a review of the new Steven Wilson album, The Harmony Codex. Approaching the merest idea of reviewing the newest album from their Royal Highness Steven Wilson is a daunting prospect. Not only from the fact that Wilson is often held in such a regard by his fanbase as to be immune to criticism, but also the fact that I consider myself to be a member of that fanbase, but I most assuredly do not think either he or his work is faultless or exempt from a critical, and if necessary, scurrilous eye. In a shocking and terribly controversial take, I know, I did not care one iota for the future bites. I found it to be a middling, tedious, unexciting plod through soundscapes and atmospheres that have been done 100 times better by 100 different artists. It wasn't entirely without merit. The production was, of course, absolutely phenomenal, as is befitting of Wilson's reputation, but honestly at this point it's hard not to expect this from him, as almost to a fault his knowledge and understanding of what makes a record sound good means that we have come to assume that the production of his work will be nothing short of the gold standard, not just of progressive rock, but of music in general. But I digress. For the most part, I consider myself very much a super fan of Wilson, and even took the time out to excitedly scream at him during an album signing event recently, where I did my level best not to stutter like an excited teenager, and did very well to not vomit nervously in front of him, a fact of which I am still immensely proud of. It is difficult to know where to really start with Wilson. I would very rarely point to anything within his solo works as a good place to start, preferring to angle people towards the more immediate and accessible of his works within Porcupine Tree, albums such as In Absentia, Lightbulb Sun or Stupid Dream, as these lack the impenetrable wall-like elements of titanic albums like Grace for Drowning or The Raven That Refused to Sing. For those of us who are already on board with his solo offerings and have been following him with the scrutiny that an artist like this deserves, the Harmony Codex has been subject to a considerable amount of pre-release hype, which was compounded by the polarising response the Future Bites gave the prog community and his established fanbase. People started falling into one of two camps: those who wanted more of this kind of electronica sound, and those who wanted a return to the more traditionally prog rock sounds of both Raven and Hand Cannot Erase. It was very much feeling like Wilson was being pushed into an unwinnable scenario here, being unable to satisfy everyone, and being at risk of further alienating or pushing away his previously established base. But in true Wilson fashion, he's done the only realistic thing he could possibly have done in this scenario, which is to stay true to himself, close his ears off to external influence, and create yet another album that is exclusively him, uniquely him, and couldn't really have been made by anyone else other than him. The Harmony Codex is not the Future Bites Part 2, or Hand Cannot Erase the sequel. This is another fiercely unique, daring, bold and innovative release that pushes the boundaries between music and art even further than I ever could have expected. Yes, there's principled DNA of the Future Bites here, but whereas that release was dripping in a kind of boomer-esque cynicism and begrudging attitude, the Harmony Codex feels a more natural, evolving, fluid and organic record, no less affected by the traditional Wilson melancholy, but there's a more narrative-driven central flow to the entire album that feels like it has the kind of confidence and backbone that I wish the Future Bites had. The Harmony Codex is a record that feels like it has taken its time to come into this world, and it has. Every inch of this album feels like a drawn-out and intricate process where mistakes have been punished, purged and scrubbed out, creating an experience that feels so polished and refined but still manages to sidestep the possibility of it feeling like it's too perfect. There's a griminess to a lot of the songs on this album, a feeling of filth, of dirt and rawness, but a rawness that's been expertly practiced and moulded into a shape designed to provoke a reaction from the listener. And provoke a reaction this album certainly has done. Past releases of Wilson's, notably Hand Cannot Erase, Raven and Grace for Drowning, were embraced by the prog community immediately. all three being seen as exemplary samples not only of Steven's work but of modern prog rock in general. It's not unusual to see some, or possibly all of these albums sitting pretty in people's top 10 records of all time. But since To the Bone, the community has been less immediately favourable to Wilson's output, with equal parts blind praise and angry mob with pitchforks coming out to denounce him forever and ever, amen. And the Harmony Codex has been no different. I always endeavour to avoid the community's opinion on an album until I've reviewed it in full, as I don't want any outside stimuli to impact on my own opinion of a record, and try to deny it as we might, we are all ultimately animals who are swayed and influenced by the reactions of our peers. We're only human after all, and there's no shame in that. But avoiding the thoughts of others, given the magnitude of this release on the prog calendar, has been nearly impossible for me. It's been fascinating to watch the reactions go up and down, left and right, round in circles and back again with this release. I think more so than anything else he's ever done, the burden of expectation has hung heavy over the Harmony Codex, and that's chiefly in part to how vitriolic the reception of the Future Bites was. So many people screaming that this is the same album again, so many screaming that they wanted Raven Part 2, so many people missing the point that repeating himself has never been Wilson's MO. Yes, this contains a lot of the electronic elements that form the backbone of the Future Bites. No, this isn't a primarily guitar-driven album, and it doesn't contain some of the more classic 70s instrumentation that people might have been hoping for. But to simply dismiss this as a sequel to the Future Bites just because it's not the direct follow-up to your favourite Wilson record is not only somewhat ignorant, it's kind of hugely disrespectful to Stephen as an artist. Wilson was always damned if he did and damned if he didn't with this, so frankly I am delighted that he went with what was right for himself on this album and avoided any pressure to create anything like what has come before. Now, I do not consider the Harmony Codex to be my favourite Wilson solo record, nor my second or even possibly my third favourite, but it is the album of his that I admire the most. This is the album that I think is the most exclusive of his musical identity, the album that I would point to when people ask me just who the heck is this guy. There's little bits of everything in this album, from pretty much every single corner of his solo career, as well as the entire scope of his time with Porcupine Tree. There's the dreamy electronic soundscapes from the Future Bites, the psychedelia and non-standard structuring of Grace for Drowning, the angst and frustration of In Absentia, the sombre, sobering theming of Raven, the dirge-like qualities of Insurgents. Every single song feels like there's a little part of Stephen's soul being born for us all to see, and it is honestly such a treat to see an artist like Wilson making such an efficient and enjoyable summary of his career to date within a record like this. It arguably has the least specific sound of his discography, given that it pays homage to so much of what has come before it, so I can understand if people wanted to levy that as a criticism against the Harmony Codex. But it feels in some ways that this is an album that could have only existed at this point in Wilson's life, as it has needed the extent and experience gained from everything that came prior to it before this could have ever existed. And for that reason alone, I can't personally hold any familiarity with his earlier works against this, as without them, this album would have never materialised, given how important they are to everything that this album represents. Now, I'm not going to do a track-by-track, blow-by-blow breakdown of this album, as frankly, I don't think this is the sort of record that benefits from that kind of analysis. You can't really, pick and choose nuggets from this to enjoy independent of the experience as a whole. This is one of those albums that you either listen to the entire thing in one sitting, or you don't at all. As to do so, I feel otherwise diminishes the impact of each song rather dramatically. Going from the complex progressive landscapes of freeform jazz of Impossible Tightrope into the beguiling and beautiful rock bottom feels like the hindsight of one impacts on the effect of the other. And this happens in a sort of a rolling sequence across the album. The more straightforward, vocals-driven Time Is Running Out feels necessary and soothing after the lengthy, dirge-like and oppressive title track. The blunt-faced Actual Brutal Facts makes the subsequent track of Staircase feel like Wilson's hands are being removed from your neck as he lets you breathe finally. It all feels so appropriate and well laid out, with each mood and sequence being part of an intimately designed pattern made to be as evocative as possible. Wilson has always been a champion of the art form of the album, and while everything prior to this always made the case for this, the Harmony Codex feels like the boldest and plainest statement of this fact. Music is art and art is music. There are moments on this album that don't feel so much like music as they feel like a sonic expression of his inner turmoil, eschewing traditional structuring and instrumentation in favour of creating an angular or necessarily uncomfortable mood. For a perfect example of this, the title track manages to stretch a simple electronic melody out over nearly 10 minutes, layering and reversing on top of itself to an absurd degree, creating an almost Penrose staircase effect, managing to loop back on itself and creating texture unlike anything else within his discography. I won't lie, this was my least favourite song on my first listen, but it's just indicative of how you can't casually listen to this album. This is a record that not only demands your attention, but requires it, as I would comfortably now put the title track in the best of list from his solo work. I mean, if you watched Shawshank Redemption in the background, right, and you subsequently complained that you didn't get it, or you weren't that invested in it, do you think that might be because you weren't really watching it, or because it's a bad film? It's the same with the Harmony Codex. This is a record that needs to be heard on the best sound system available to you, and it needs to be treated as the only thing that's going on for you in the world during your time with it. This is music that is damaged immeasurably by distraction, and it is so important if you want to actually figure out just what the hell Wilson is doing here, that you put time aside to work with this album. This isn't an easy casual listen that you can just put on shuffle or enjoy as background music. This is complicated, layered, nuanced and deeply personal music, and will give as much back to you as you are prepared to put into it. Now, before this gets into the runaway Steven Wilson circle jerk, this album is definitely not without fault, and honestly, the biggest flaw for me is the fact that this demands so much of your attention in order for it to unlock its secrets. I don't always have the sort of time that this record insists on. This is 64 minutes long, and there's not a lot of levity to this record. Its density is often its undoing, resulting in moments in the early days where I would just space out for a while and not really be able to recall anything of the last 3 to 4 minutes, especially on some of the longer tracks here. I do also feel that perhaps Ninette Tayeb is underused here, almost feeling like Steven has included her as a sort of a hand cannot erase thirst trap. Her appearance on Rock Bottom is wonderful, don't get me wrong, but I feel like perhaps she would have been well suited to provide additional vocals on tracks like Economies of Scale, What Life Brings, and Time Is Running Out. When you've got one of the greatest female vocalists of the modern age, to only use her in less than 4 minutes of a 64-minute long record feels like a crime punishable by a creative medieval form of torture. Other than that though, for me personally, the Harmony Codex largely succeeds at its goals, creating a sonically rich, musically dense album that has to be truly seen as an experience event, rather than something to be enjoyed at a surface level. Will I champion this album as one of his greatest works? Probably not, but that's more down to what I personally prefer out of Wilson's output rather than anything specifically negative to be said about this album. Yes, I do prefer the Ravens, the Hand Cannot Erases, the In Absentias, and the Deadwings, but that's just me. And if Steven never makes a record like those ever again, I'm honestly fine with that, because I will always have those albums to listen to. I am satisfied for Steven to continue to innovate, to push the envelope as to what can be expected from him and his musical endeavours. Let's not forget, this man has been creating the weird and the wonderful since day one, and anyone who tells you otherwise simply has no idea what kind of artist Wilson is. And I will forever applaud him for going against expectation in order to create precisely what he feels he needs to. So, what else can I say about Steven Wilson's The Harmony Codex? This one was every bit as controversial and weird as I was expecting. I won't pretend that The Future Bites didn't make me flinch, as it simply wasn't an album for me, and I was worried that this is going to be what Wilson was sticking to for the foreseeable future. And while the Harmony Codex is definitely grown from the same soil as what came immediately before it, there's so many elements of every part of his musical identity to be found here that it makes even the parts I'm not as keen on easier to swallow in the long-term appreciation of the album. I can't confidently say that I recommend buying this one in physical format, as this is likely to completely split people's opinions, as all truly great and memorable art should do. But I would encourage people to at the very least check this out in digital format, but please try and get the highest bitrate you can and the best speakers you can listen to it with, as to do anything less would be really missing out on the immaculate production and one of the best sounding records ever made. This is all, of course, guys, very much my opinion, as you should well know by now, so if you have listened to the Harmony Codex, please tell me what you thought about this record in the comments down below. If you did like this video, please do share it around with anyone else you think would possibly enjoy it, and please do consider subscribing to the channel for more content in the future. I'm going to leave my link tree down below, where you will find all the places to find me on social media, as well as a link to my Ko-fi page if you're feeling particularly generous and want to help support the channel. But until next time, guys, as always, keep your rhyme signatures very, very odd.